And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Today we have put together something very special and different for you. We talk a lot about Research Works, the name of our podcast. And yes, in the true sense of the word, we truly believe that research does work. But as well as that, we've been talking about how research comes to us, I suppose, as a bit of an end product. And for us as consumers of that work to be able to absorb it and digest it and those real take-home messages that are a culmination of a lot of work that happens behind the scenes. So there's so much of that happens that we thought it would be great to get someone in today to talk about what really makes research work.
I know, it really is the true sense of the word. I think it's just so important to talk about all of this because it's the background that makes the research come to us, and it's really good to portray the true story about what does happen, and there's so many lessons to be learned. I wish someone would tell me all of this before I got started as well, because I think I would have been a smoother path. I don't know. But I think it's really great to know about this, and this isn't to scare anyone off or anything like that. No. It really is just to kind of go, well, what are the things you need to think about, and who are the people out there that could possibly help you? And this is just all part of the journey, really.
And you never know, there may be a specific part of the research journey that really interests you.
That's right.
Dear listeners, and you might want to get involved in a little bit more or ask a few more questions about.
Yes.
So to help us with our chat today, we would like to introduce our guest who has a whole lot of experience around the logistics of research and helps us to make research work. And for that, we'd like to welcome to the show Mitch Adams. Hi, Mitch.
Thanks, Ash and Dana. It's great to be here. I've been listening to your back catalogue over the last few days in preparation for this. I've been so impressed by the range of researchers that you've had on board. So I'm excited to be with you today.
Yes, that's really cool. Well, we love that you're here with us because I've had the privilege of getting to work with you over the last few months over some projects, and I'm like, I don't know what I would do without Mitch.
And Mitch is part of the Kids Rehab team at Perth Children's Hospital and Telethon Kids Institute, and he handles a lot of the logistics around a lot of the major research studies that come out of that Kids Rehab team. So Mitch, for those of you who don't know him, is not a scientist or a researcher, but he is, I suppose, the glue that holds our entire team together and helps us along that journey from idea through to translation.
Yep, that is absolutely correct. When we talk about logistics and research, we're talking about how our obligations are met, from ethics, contracts, grant funding, making sure people get paid, making sure all governance is in order. There's just so much to it. So all of these things are absolutely essential. And if you can consider all of this as part of your research journey, hopefully you'll just have less roadblocks along the way and it can just be a whole lot more enjoyable.
Absolutely. So Mitch, if you've been listening to our back catalogue, you'll know that we do a little icebreaker to start our episodes.
Yes.
So the question that we have today is, if you had to choose one for the rest of your life out of staying up late or getting up early each day, which would you choose and why?
I have always aspired to being a morning person, but never quite lived up to that aspiration. So given the opportunity to have a revolutionary change in my life, I would love to be up at 5 o'clock every morning with the birds and the bees and enjoying that early morning start to the
Even
day.
in winter?
Oh, even winter's the best. I come from Canberra originally, so Perth winters are nothing. Right?
Oh, come on. This is a truly, truly wintry winter.
We've had some rain.
We have a lot of rain. Well, I love that you want to be a morning person because I reckon the morning is the best time. I am definitely a morning person. I would love to do that for the rest of my life. I am actually the kind of person that cannot even sleep in. So if I sleep until about 8:30, I start to get really antsy. Then I feel a little bit anxious that I've missed out on my day. So I'll do that because then it'll give me the excuse to go to bed early without feeling bad. You went to bed at 8:30. Well, yes, I did. So that'll suddenly be more socially acceptable. What about you, Ash, mother of two?
Look, I think my interpretation of this question is if you chose one that would be easy for you to do for the rest of your life. So I'm going to choose to be a morning person in the hopes that would make it much easier to be a morning person. Because like Mitch, I think I've always aspired to be a morning person. I am one, but not by choice at the moment. But I would like it to be something that is
enjoyable
at some point. Enjoyable.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. That's fair. Well, I feel like we've gotten to know everyone really well. Basically, the summary that I'm going to take home is everyone wants to be like me and be a morning person and wake up really early.
It feels really productive.
It does. See, that's why you get antsy by 8 or 8:30 because, like, you know, your day's gone. So, anyway.
You got bed in 4 hours.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, let's get to know Mitch a little bit more now that we know that he wants to be a morning person. But I guess let's get behind what kind of person Mitch is and what it is that he does within the Kids Rehab team. So we all get to know that area, because I don't think many people know about the person that often does this whole glue behind the scenes of all things.
Absolutely.
So, Mitch, what brought you into this area in the first place?
So I had a bit of a winding path towards medical research over the last few years. So I started out my career in international development. So I spent 8 years managing international development programs throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
Wow.
So they were not necessarily in health. I worked on some HIV programs as well as education and governance programs, both based in Australia and living overseas. After a few years of that, it becomes quite demanding on your time, and so I made the decision to focus on Australia after a while. And so I spent a few years working for Social Ventures Australia, which is a not-for-profit management consulting firm, or at least the arm that I was working for was in around management consulting for not-for-profit organisations. And then found my way here into the Kids Rehab research team at the Children's Hospital here in Perth, out of, I guess, just an aspiration to work in health and science and to be involved in some pretty amazing medical research projects.
Oh, that is really cool.
Yeah. And Mitch, tell us a bit about what your passions are around research. What things are you passionate about?
So I'm a born geek. So I love data. As part of my transition away from international development back into the domestic sector, I retrained as a data scientist. So I have a data science background, and so I love nothing more than to sit down with some data and to try to tell a story out of meaningless numbers. And so awesome. I will spend an inordinate amount of time perfecting the perfect graph to really communicate what we're trying to say.
I've noticed. So it's awesome.
We love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Graphics are what I'm passionate about. So yeah, that's what in terms of research, that's what I'm passionate about. Outside of research, I love to scuba dive. So it's like being on Mars, I think, when we're down there.
That's very
cool. So I guess you sort of talked a bit about it there in a way by the things that you really enjoy and what you like. So maybe just more explicitly now, what's your role in the Kids Rehab team?
Yeah, so everything that makes the science happen. So all the way, so if we think through the life cycle of research, we sort of do some idea generation by engaging with consumers of research and with clinicians, and then all the way through, writing a grant, making sure that we have the governance and ethics around those grants once they're awarded, and making sure that there's budget, making sure that people are paid. Like these science programs, they rely on science, but they also rely on having the right people, enough money, finding participants who want to engage with it, and then being able to turn that research into changes in practice. And so I'm involved in the logistics of all of those different parts of the science process.
And I love that you described it as the life cycle of research, because I think, it truly is in every sense of the phrase. And if we think about the life cycle of research, there's probably, oftentimes little sticking points throughout that cycle that might cause researchers, stress and frustration. So I thought we might start by talking a little bit about what some of those are before we move on to some of the more positive aspects of research. And, for our listeners who maybe don't have a research background or haven't been involved in a research project before, let's start by talking about, where some of the potholes are along that cycle.
For sure. I think for me, there's two big ones that I see all the time. One is just timelines. We think a lot about projects in terms of the availability of budget, but very often that's also linked to the availability of time in which to spend that budget.
Yes.
and we need to make sure that the money and the time are adequate for the project. We all know that certain parts of the project lifestyle take a long time, like ethics and governance processes often take months, 3 to 6 months at a time. But we don't really think about and plan for some of the unexpected things that happen, like, researchers, are sick for a while, or a common challenge that we face is the timelines around recruitment, that if you have a narrow eligibility window in terms of age for a particular study, or if the particular involvement conditions are such that there aren't that many people coming through each year that meet those qualification criteria, it can take a long time to recruit enough participants. And then if you're not, you might have all the therapists available to deliver your intervention. But if you don't have enough participants coming online and you've made some heroic assumptions around the number that will be available to you, then it can be difficult, because the funding for your people will run out in terms of timeline before you hit your power numbers for the necessary power for the study.
And sometimes those constraints are because researchers are eternal optimists, and you're always putting the blue sky picture on paper to get your funding, but sometimes those restrictions are kind of given to you by the funders, aren't they? They will only give you funding for X number of years, or for a certain period of time, so you have to try and make that work within your project. And that's something that can be a bit of a sticking point as well.
Yeah, that's right. We're always trying to fit our projects within the constraints of the funders, and the practical reality is that we're often reliant on multiple funders for any particular project. So you might have one funder is providing a fellowship for a postdoc researcher who's leading a study, and then another funder is funding the study itself, the therapy time or the RCT costs. So it can be a challenge to balance those two elements of it.
Yeah. Wow, it really is so much to think about there. And I think from what I hear here as well, in terms of recruitment, it is like the number one thing that you try to do everything you possibly can, because every single participant that you get coming through is so incredibly valuable.
Yes.
I think of all the studies that I've been involved with, and think of all the things that myself and my team have done to maintain and retain all participants in the study has been tremendous. Like, I remember this one time, I think this was part of my PhD, and we had participants come through and we had assessments on a Saturday because it was the best time to get them. We knew that they'd turn up. We knew that we'd have access to MRI in the gate lab. So one day, it was one child's birthday on that Saturday. We thought, well, we got to really celebrate it because they've come in. It's a big deal. So we thought we'd do something really nice. So I baked a cake, put candles on it, and we sang happy birthday to this kid. All the parents were there. All the other participants were there. And after we sang happy birthday, the kid blows out the candles, and then we saw the smoke rise, and then we went, oh my goodness, this is going to set off the smoke detectors. And we're in like a wing of a hospital. And so we all had this panic. So literally then everyone on that floor grabbed their books and were fanning away the smoke just to make sure we didn't get the smoke detectors going. And I was like, man, these are the things you do just to, I really appreciate everyone who's part of it, because it's not just us as researchers that get this extra number for our power. People are sacrificing a fair bit to be involved in it too, aren't they? Like, to come to the assessments, and there's just things to think about, aren't there, on the bigger picture?
Yeah, and I think on that note as well, because participants' time is so valuable, and in health and medical research, often, we are working with people, and in child health, we're working with families. So, there's lots of cogs that need to fit together for a participant to turn up in the right place at the right time. So one of the things that I've really thought about over the course of the journey is to pilot everything, practice everything that you plan on doing with a participant, so that when your first participant rocks up on the first day of testing, you know exactly what's going to happen, how long it's going to take, who you need to be there, from how they're going to get in the building to how they're going to find you in the room to how you're going to explain the assessments and the things that you're doing.
That's right.
Those kinds of things are so important to practice because, you can quickly come unstuck, and timelines can blow out in that way as well, I think.
Yeah, what makes sense at the beginning of any project, we'll sit down and say, okay, it's going to take 5 minutes for this and 10 minutes for that. it takes way longer than you might expect when you write it on a piece of, it's like an
Yeah.
Escher drawing, right? Like you can draw it out and it makes sense on a piece of paper. But
And imaginary people are really compliant.
that's right. Yeah. Imaginary people don't have a second 4-year-old who is running around going crazy in the background and distracting everybody.
Yeah.
And so,
I love the idea that you just said that as well. You have to pilot everything. And it's not just about piloting for the assessment and how long it takes, but also just the process that you're going to run through. Again, another study I was doing some pilot work and I was doing some stuff in a gate lab. And so I booked the room, I booked everything that I thought I needed. And I had this kid that was coming up from 2 hours away that really wanted to be part of the study. So I thought, well, I'll get there 2 hours earlier, make sure everything's there. And thank goodness that I did, because when I walked into the room, all of the materials that I needed to actually capture the gate was gone. So it was normally it was meant to be there. There was meant to be these cameras, the computer. And I just remember standing there and just about had this absolute panic because this kid was coming. So I was running around school trying to find someone who would tell me where it was. And the bottom line of that was I was told that if it's not bolted to the ground, you got to book it. So from then onwards, I booked every single piece of equipment that I needed. But if I hadn't have piloted that, I wouldn't have known that. I would have had all these participants come in on this one day with nothing to capture the data from. And that would have been, that would have pushed the entire timeline out. Yeah. So pilot. I think is the main take home from this first part to avoid those frustrations.
Absolutely. So moving on from, the frustrating or time-consuming aspects of research, maybe Dana, we'll start with you on this one. What's something that you're really proud of, and what's, what are some of the little victories along the way that you've experienced?
The victories along the way would always be, I think, really team focused. Even just the other day, we're doing a study at the moment where it's quite dependent on tech working. I think whenever tech's involved, I think there's a lot to take home there. So we had a bit of a malfunction with one of the pieces of equipment, and we had a participant there right there and then. And what I was most impressed with was, I had a team member come up to me and just with a really calm face just went, "Something has gone wrong." And I was like, "Really? Because you're looking really calm right now." But the whole team was actually just really calm about it. Everyone just readjusted. They went into problem-solving mode. Someone gets onto the phone, calls a university so you can get a replacement. It's a storm of the century, apparently, which didn't actually happen. But everyone just came up with a solution. And that, to me, was a massive victory. And I think that just shows the preparation involved in a team. Yeah. And that when you do have that, you might hit these roadblocks along the way, but then you're doing everything you can to solve it. And I think that is a really good depiction of people who are really invested in the process and want to be part of it. And it's nothing is too difficult, but we can find a solution together. So I reckon that would be the biggest victory I've had, in any project, is when you see people rally around the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What about you, Mitch?
Yeah, I mean, I think a slow rolling victory for us in our team at Kids Rehab has been the Early Moves project, which is a sub-project of Origins, which people might be familiar with. It's quite a large study, so it's got an N of 3,000 participants, and so it's tested all these things that we've talked about in terms of making sure that you have your planning and your processing and your pilots all lined up, and all of your systems and processes are sort of documented and fit for scale, I guess. And so the success of that project, we just recruited our 1,000th participant out of 3,000. Wow. Is really reflective of a huge amount of effort by all those team members. I think, as you mentioned, Dana, these things involve so many people who work so hard to pull off. And so I think that's been our victory over the last 12 months.
Yeah, and I think celebrating those victories is really important as well, and comes back to the cohesion of your team and recognizing that everyone's played a huge part in making something like that happen and getting a project to that point that, everyone should be celebrating that because they've all played a really big role in that happening. Yeah,
and I've noticed that the evolving of a researcher is when you stop sort of just saying I, because it's my research, what I'm doing. And I think once you've sort of being able to sort of see how a team works and how your team can be so cohesive. Your language changes and you understand what that means. And I feel like that's how you can sort of tell that someone's moved along on that journey and they start talking about our team, my team, what we have done. And then I think from there, that's where the victories do come along, because it's such a great path to be, otherwise it's quite lonely.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things you got to sort out by yourself, and that ain't fun.
No. And your project is ultimately never going to be a successful one without your team.
That's right. As the studies get larger, your team expands and expands and expands, right? Yeah. You start out as an individual researcher, maybe you have a PhD supervisor.
Yeah.
And then you're working in a team of people you can see and touch and feel.
Yep.
And then before long, you're working in a national or sometimes international collaboration. And that as you increase scale, it adds all sorts of complexity as well as benefits. So I think that's also been a thing that I've observed, is the need for really explicit and frequent communication with people who you don't see all the time, and to keep up those Zoom meetings as frequently as you can.
Yeah. And so just on that, Mitch, how do you think this, time of global pandemic and COVID-19, how do you think that's has that changed how you've had to, do some of those communications or think about how the projects are rolled out in a slightly different way?
Yeah, I think it's forced all of us to jump ahead sort of 5 or 6 years in terms of where we would otherwise be right now.
Yeah, true.
We've been able to run training that we ordinarily would have done in person online. It isn't perfect, but nor is in-person training. So I think we're learning to improve how we run those sorts of things. I think we're all becoming more familiar and accustomed to Teams, but I think we're also all appreciating the importance of human contact and person-to-person communication is quite different to even a well-functioning online setup. I think a lot of people face real challenges with working from home and working remotely, and so I'm looking forward to the point in which we can all be back in the office.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think with everything being online, there's so many lessons learnt there. I mean, Ash, what would you think would be the biggest take home with doing things online and things to think about?
Well, I think like Mitch said, there's some real pros to the online platforms in terms of how you can scale your projects and the breadth and the scope of them. Pivoting and putting things like training online where you can means that you then have reach, much further than just your team where you are.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. Obviously, there's the cons to just purely an online platform, I think, are that you do lose some of those important conversations and, the benefit of that face-to-face contact that you would have with your team members. Sometimes things can get a little bit lost in translation if it's over email or over a Zoom call or a Teams call. So I think, for me, it's really highlighted how important and beneficial that face-to-face contact is when you can get it. But when you can't, I think, it's, like Mitch said, it's forced us to upskill in a way that maybe we wouldn't have had to not for this global pandemic.
Yeah. And I think what that really comes down to again is it's all about communication. Like for a well-functioning research project to get off the ground and have the effect that you want it to, communication is key. So Mitch, in light of all the projects you've been part of, what will be some of the pearls of wisdom you have for us in terms of how do we keep a log of communication? How do we communicate with everyone we need to? Tell us how to do it. Come on.
I think have a bias towards over communication. I think this is a fault of mine. I often reflect when something goes wrong that actually, I probably should have. I held back on sending that email because I don't want to flood people's inboxes. But in fact, people would prefer to have the email and ignore it than to not have the information at all. So a bias towards over communication is probably the first step. You don't want to overload people with meetings because people's time is valuable, but using a variety of communication tools that are, I guess, appropriate for your project.
Yeah. And do you keep logs? Like, do you keep communication logs, or so you know who you've talked to, or Do you sort your emails out in a certain way?
So internally within our team, we use a project management tool called Asana. Okay. So there's lots of equivalent tools around there for the larger projects. Sure. And so I think that's a pretty good way of just tracking where things are up to, so that researcher one doesn't have to send an email saying, where's this up to? They can just jump on Asana and see where that particular job is up to, and you can leave notes. Of course, it requires everybody to be quite diligent.
Yeah, sure. And update and say what you've done.
Yeah, that's right. But I think once it builds up a head of steam, then people start to see the value in it, and therefore it can save people time and over the long run.
And once it becomes habit and people are used to operating in that way, it becomes kind of second nature, and that's a really important tool that, you know, carries you through that research cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose when I think about, you know, the last few minutes of conversation, we've talked a lot about communication, and I think that when I reflect on key attributes of really successful researchers, the common thread among all of them is this ability to communicate and communicate well across all aspects. You know, there's communication involved in preparing your grant submission, you know, communicating the idea that you're trying to get funding for to be able to ultimately, you know, create that project. You know, you have communication around all the key personnel and stakeholders that are involved in that project throughout the life course of it. There's communication with participants and consumers of that research. And then there's also communication in a way, you know, in a scientific way that then gets your paper published or any other, you know, translation materials that you're creating to ultimately get that message out there. So for me, communication is a really key attribute across every single stage of research.
Yeah, I think there's so much there that when you actually lay it out that way, you go, well, actually, that's the entire job really as a researcher. And, you know, when you have a funder who is willing to invest money in you, at the end of the day, it's very competitive. So when they've decided that they want to invest in the idea that your team has come up with, it's really important to communicate that back to them. Like, it's not like it's like an annual, I need to write another report for them. Actually, it's okay. Like, I think you really need to make sure that process is kept up to speed, because then there is this lovely relationship you can have. And if you need to have a chat to them about, you know, we need an extension, or we haven't managed to recruit everyone yet, they're part of that journey and that story. I mean, from a budget perspective, Mitch, I know I've seen your spreadsheet, so I know that you have planned for things along the way. So when you think of a budget, what are some of the things that you really put into that budget that us as researchers routinely don't seem to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think returning to that theme of time and participants, right? Like, so when we think about a budget, the place we usually start is probably around participants.
Right.
So how many people do we need according to our power calculations? And then you work backwards from there. So start to document some of the assumptions, just as we did with piloting and, you know, making some estimates of how long each step in the process would take, and then testing those assumptions. We would probably do a similar sort of thing with the budget. So if we need, you know, 100 participants for a particular study, then step back through that process to think exactly what are our assumptions around what's required for each participant, how many people do we need to approach for every single person who agrees, and how much time does each of those approaches take. And then, so once you've got participants, you can estimate how much time you need for each participant for each step in that research journey. And then from there, you can start to build out the dollars from there. I think building in some contingencies quite explicitly in your budgeting is quite important. What people often forget to do is that they'll use the current dollar rates for your staff, but there's often a 6 to 12 month delay between when you submit a grant application and when it's approved, and then another 6 to 12 months before you actually have your first participant. And so therefore your salary rates are out by 5%, and that's, you know, that's quite it's a reasonable amount of money that you have to claw back elsewhere in the budget if you're now paying your interventionists a bit more than you had expected.
And if it's a 5-year project, then, you know, there's that increase, that pay increase over the course of the 5 years as well. So, you know, that's something that you need to think about, how long the project's actually going for once you get to a point where you can start.
And I think it's often the on cost that you know, researchers or therapists might not have thought about before, because on costs can be quite significant, but they're really necessary. Can you talk us through a little bit of some of the on cost things to think about?
Yeah, so when we talk about on costs, we're talking about things like superannuation for casual staff, casual leave loading. Most universities will apply a percentage for just to account for annual leave and sick leave and maternity leave, paternity leave, all those sorts of things, as well as workers' compensation insurance, all these sorts of things. So typically that on cost can be anywhere between sort of 25 and 45% in addition to the salary rate, depending on what it is. I think people make a mistake when they refer to it as on cost because funders look at that and they think, oh, wow, what on earth is your university charging? It sounds like they're charging for all the buildings and everything.
Yeah.
So I usually just break it down as taxes, superannuation, casual leave loading, and those sorts of things. I think funders are very happy to pay for those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So whoever is funding your study, have a look at their policies. They're usually pretty clear around what the on costs are and make sure they're included, because not including them can mean you're 50% out of budget.
That's a decent amount to be out.
Yeah. And ultimately that means you have to recruit less people, or you don't get to deliver on the project that you intended to deliver on. There has to be changes need to be made and cuts need to be made to be able to fit within your budget.
And this often comes up quite late in the project, right? People aren't really paying that much. They don't really understand their budget well enough. They're not paying enough attention to what their spend rate is, and so they're halfway through and they're 70% through the budget, and they think, it's quite late then to try and solve that problem, and we have to go and find some money elsewhere to cover that gap. But planning for it from the start is always an important step.
Yeah, that's important. Otherwise, there's the potential for a lot of expletives and need for a lot of consoling from all your team members by the time you get to that stage, because that's often the most important phase. Is you want to get to the end and be able to do some knowledge translation.
Yeah.
And if you end up, taking some money that you would have spent on that to now spending it for the recruitment, you're missing this component which we are very passionate about talking about, and that's knowledge translation.
Yeah.
And then that ends up going to, maybe I need to find another grant for that, so that pushes that out. So suddenly that whole 17 years between the knowledge generation and translation to the general population, it makes sense. Like I know that I've got papers that I'm trying to get out that I might have done 5 years ago, but it takes that long to get it together. And then to make sure you've got a bit of a budget to put it out in open access, for example. And suddenly 5-7 years have passed and, you've got 10 years left to try to get it out to everyone else.
Yeah. And I think the thing that maybe doesn't get spoken about so often is that when there are budget restrictions, often researchers will try and absorb that workload. It becomes a bit of a love job, and they're doing it
100%. Yep.
They're doing it, after hours or on weekends, or, in addition to their full, clinical workload that they might have, because there hasn't been the budget to support them to finish that project that they're really passionate about finishing. And that's, an aspect of research that I don't think it's starting to get talked about a little bit more now, but it's a really important consideration, in the life cycle of your project. Yeah,
we should pay people for the work that they do.
Yeah.
And it's a huge demand on researchers who aren't fully funded for their studies. It's exhausting. They have other jobs and other life responsibilities.
Yeah.
And from a strategic point of view, it's a huge risk as well. Because if as part of a research team, you are relying on people to be doing extra work outside of work hours, that's just not a sustainable situation. Right. And so you may end up not being able to complete that study. And so I think at the grant preparation stage, there's a lot of stress, right? We're all putting together these budgets and trying to make assumptions that are reasonable, and so there's a lot of pressure to say, oh, we don't need 0.4 FTE for that, we need 0.3, and it's those sorts of moments. And we make those decisions all the time, right up until the moment of grant submission, and so sometimes we squeeze the researcher time, but wherever possible, I think it's important to include a realistic estimate of how much time things take, because just things like research management, participant recruitment, data management, all these things we don't think enough about how much time the administrative side of that takes for researchers.
And the risk of burnout is huge. And we know we've been talking about that a whole lot more in the industry now for researchers. Burnout is it's a big thing because we are driven by, a lot of the funding or our position as a researcher. Depends on how many articles you might have published, how many grants you might have received. And that does require a lot of additional extra work. A grant that I was part of submitting with Mitch recently, we're sort of joking about along the way going, well, we haven't got the budget right. We're the ones that'll have to pay for it because we'll be the ones, trying to absorb it. And it's a bit of a joke, but it's also just to kind of go, we need to make it really realistic. And I could feel the pull of me going, nah, we can do it. I can just do it in this time. And Mitch was the one who was like, no, this needs to be realistic. And I guess that just highlights the importance of having a team that looks after each other and has different skill sets to go, no, that's not realistic. This is what the budget looks like. This is what we can do.
Yeah.
And the result of it was a more realistic, grant submission of where we would get to. We had this grand plan of, saving the world. And now we've kind of gone, okay, no, we can save half of the world and then we can see what happens from there.
Yeah.
But that was realistic.
Yeah. I mean, I find as boring as the budget is, it's quite a clarifying process, right? Because
absolutely,
research ideas start out as these big, grand, vague ideas, but over the course of going through a budget, you have to figure out who exactly is doing exactly how much work and what are they doing and where are they going to do it. And so it sort of pulls things back into reality and quite concrete plans, and that helps us work through some of those issues.
Yeah.
I remember that grant submission that we worked together because it was quite stressful in the end. 3 or 4 days to go. We were still updating the budget on the day of the submission of that budget. So a very large grant, multi-million dollars. And on the day of submission, I went to upload the budget into the online portal for the funder. And I discovered that the budget was just completely broken. All of my internal checks were showing red and I couldn't find the errors anywhere. And so, I mean, these grants, there's like some of the smartest researchers in Australia have been working for weeks and weeks and weeks on them. And so there's quite a lot of pressure to get it in. And so I was starting to get a little bit panicky. What if we can't submit this because of my mistake? And before long, when you start to panic, you can't do anything. Your eyes sort of glaze over a little bit. And you
didn't tell me that on the day.
I don't think I could.
I think that was strategic.
I actually had to, so in my international development days, I did kidnap training. So what to do if you get kidnapped.
Okay.
And,
wow.
And here's a tip that what they train, I can't remember much of it, but what they do train you to do is that the first step is to make sure that you can't make any good decisions when your heart rate is elevated, right?
Okay.
So physiologically, your brain can't think, and you have low dexterity and all those sorts of things. And so the first thing they teach you to do is just breathe and lower your heart rate and return yourself and center yourself so you can make good decisions on the fact that you've been kidnapped. And so as I was panicking about not being able to submit this budget, I was like, all right, I just have to breathe. Got myself back centered and then found that I'd made a stupid mistake. Resolved it and submitted that grant in time.
Oh, Mitch, this is making my eyes water. I don't even remember. You didn't tell me this, did you? I think you just sorted it out. We panicked about so many other things, but only because there's just so much to do and there is a lot riding on it. And like you said, you've engaged with all of these potential collaborators and they're like, yes, this is a good idea. Then suddenly you're putting something together and, you're representing the team and the pressure of that. But again, if you have a good team, like Mitch was literally like the most dialed on my phone for that entire week as we're putting it together. But that's what it takes. And there's every possibility that we won't get this grant. We would have put in all that month's worth of work into it. But that is the life and that's part of it. And hopefully from there, if we don't get it, we can repurpose it in some other way and hopefully it'll be better. And that's the mindset you probably have to have. Otherwise, all you'll see is me rocking in a corner one day and going, we didn't get another grant.
Yeah.
I mean, these grants have, a 1 in 8, 1 in 10 success rate. And so on the one hand, that can be quite, difficult to deal with because you keep getting knocked back. But it's just the reality of doing research that you just have to be absolutely relentless in in going on even once you get knocked back for grants or fellowships or anything like that.
It's like that song. First you don't succeed. You just got to get yourself back up and try again. That's all you got to do. And that's the part that I think not everyone talks about. And it's real. And, not every grant you go for you're going to get, but you've got to believe in it enough because you've put in all that time.
Mm-hmm.
And you just got to try again, and that's okay. And it doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean you're not a good researcher. It doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. It just means the competition's high and your next grant's going to be better.
Yeah.
And
same with publications as well. Not every paper is a good fit for every journal. So, if you find that you kind of get to that stage of your work and you submit your paper somewhere and it's rejected, it doesn't mean that the work is bad or, of poor quality. It just means that it's not the right fit for that journal and you should, dust yourself off and try again.
I think that's our take-home message here. I think this is what we've come down to. So I guess if we were to summarize all the things we've spoken about, a whole lot of stuff, I would say number one is plan, pilot as much of it as you can, which will then help with your budget, and spend lots of time on your budget, because that's the part that's usually the part that would, hinder a project because you run out of money.
Yeah. And like Mitch said and has said for a lot of our projects before, it helps solidify your idea.
That's right.
So the budget is a very useful piece of your planning for actually clarifying what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
That's right. And match that up with your timeline.
Yeah.
So if you can match up your budget with your timeline, you've got you have the team that's around it. You've got everything that falls into place. So I think that was great. This is going to be a good one for my next grant that I'll
And then communicate and celebrate.
Yes.
Celebrate.
Don't forget the celebrate part. All right. Well, now that we have learnt so much from that, we are still going to go to our most favourite segment, which is Tell It Ed. This is the 60-second pitch to the everyday man, Ed, who listens in on all of our conversations, knows all about the research, and now he's a bit of a logistics man himself. So I think this is going to be really interesting. So Mitch, you've got about 60 seconds or so to summarise all these main things we talked about to the common man, Ed.
Now I'm stuck. I think as Dana and Ash have indicated that the time you spend in planning and preparation for a grant is going to be paid back to you later when you're trying to deliver it. Planning around your budget is an important part of making sure that you have no surprises later on in the project, and that you're able to meet all of the expectations of your participants and your funders, and you're able to deliver good science at the end of it.
Oh, I love it. Great summary.
Very cool.
Ed, do you have any questions?
Always lots and lots of questions. This is quite interesting to look behind the curtain of what I think are incredible people doing incredibly professional things, and yet I find out like there's just all these stories of crazy stuff that just barely makes it through by the skin of their teeth. But I think that might be the case in just about every industry or sector.
So.
But I guess my question is tailored more directly to Mitch. I'm curious about obviously where you've come from and then moving into health. It sounds like you do like a lot of project management. So do you think coming outside of health gives you a better perspective, or do you think that coming into it fresh or not having certain assumptions have made it easier or more difficult? Like, would you recommend this as a pathway for somebody with your skill set to move into, or do you think that you've had an advantage or a disadvantage moving into this space?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an advantage to come from the outside. I am the Ed of our research team, right? I think not having the sort of scientific professional background gives me the license to ask really stupid questions. There are no stupid questions, but to ask the basic questions and ask people to work through the basics of any particular problem. And I found that people often really appreciate that because often people don't understand what's going on, and just sort of having the license to ask the stupid questions and to come at it from a different perspective is quite a good way of doing it. And I think mixing in between different disciplines So inside and outside of science brings all sorts of interesting insights and different skill bases that we can draw on.
I can vouch for that. Mitch's fresh perspective is certainly an incredibly valuable one. So
it is.
Nice. There's hope for me yet.
Great question, Ed. Well, thank you so much, Mitch, for being joining us on the Research Works podcast today. I think you've really given a great insight into what it is that takes research to the next level and allows it to happen in the first place, because you are a valued member of the team. And as you can tell from both Ash and myself, we're so glad you're here. And we're just so grateful for your insight and your ability to ask us questions, because I know you've done that to me a few times. I'm like, okay, he's asking me the questions, but I'm really grateful for that. So for everyone who's been listening, I hope this helps you. And if you're thinking about doing any research, hopefully some of these pearls of wisdom and experience come in handy for you. We will put run sheet notes up onto the website as well. So if you do want to have a look, definitely head over to researchworks.net. And remember, there's a CPD form there you can fill out as well as part of your record keeping.
Thank you again, Mitch. We're so grateful that you joined us on the podcast today. And thanks to everyone for listening. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.